Welcome to today's webinar, Process Validation 4.0, Overcoming Process Validation Challenges with Technology. Thank you for joining us. My name is Madison Adams, and I am the Global Manager and Event Partner Marketing person at Kneat, and I'll help be moderating today's webinar. On this next slide, it's just a quick note. Since Kneat is a publicly traded company, we just need a copyright and disclaimer statement. This provides notice that the material presented in today's presentation is under copyright law and cannot be used without permission. Let's dive into today's agenda. First, we're going to look at the difficult challenges and solutions of process validation. Process validation is a detail-oriented, complex process. There may be obstacles that come about, but success is not out of reach, and today we will be discussing a few common challenges as well as their solutions. Then we'll talk through key trends and innovations, which will include trends for digitizing your validation process, data analytics tools, machine learning, and green validation. And lastly, we'll look at best-in-class digitization methods, which will include process analytical technologies and Kneat solutions, which will include a short demo. All of today's content is going to be delivered by Olivia Calder. She's a process validation industry expert at Kneat, an experienced process validation expert with years of firsthand experience running multiple validation activities in life sciences and manufacturing. Based in Cleveland, Ohio, she works with Kneat customers to augment and streamline their process validation programs, as well as lead customers in initial deployments of Kneat GX for a variety of validation disciplines. She is skilled in process improvement, customer service, and regulatory compliance. Olivia is a strong quality assurance professional with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Toledo. Welcome, Olivia. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you so much, Madison.
Yeah, wonderful. For today's webinar, it's likely you've joined us today because you're already working in the ever-evolving process validation landscape, or you just want to get ahead of the curve and stay informed on the latest technologies that can support your work. Whatever brings you to virtual table today, we're very glad you're here. We're going to learn some things, have a great discussion, and explore some solutions. It's going to be a great session. Before we get started on our discussion, I do want to kick off with an interactive poll. It's relevant to what we are talking about today and will help our experts better understand today's audience. A poll should go on your screen now. So a poll should be launched now. So essentially, where are you on your journey to digitalization? Is it starting with the webinar today? Is it an initial discovery? Are you about to launch your first digital project? Maybe you already have some projects delivered and are looking how to scale. Or maybe you've got multiple projects across the sites being validated digitally. Give it about 10, 15 more seconds to get people voted, and we'll kind of have an understanding of the audience today. All right, it looks like, all right, over 75% of you have voted. So I'm going to close the poll here and share the results. So with today's webinar, it's actually quite split. We've got about 50% of the audience starting with today or some initial discovery, and the other 50% are about to launch or already have some of their projects delivered digitally. So very much kind of across the scale, Olivia, just for your information about the content. So we've got people from all different groups.
Great.
All right, with that, I've got a few things just to talk about Kneat before we get into the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. So for those that may not be as familiar with Kneat, we are the leading digital validation solution in the life sciences industry. We are a global organization with presence around the world, including 40,000 users and more than 50 in our partner network. We work with 8 of the top 10 life sciences companies and are ISO 9001:2015 and 27001 certified. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Olivia to get into the topic today of process validation.
Great, thank you so much, Madison. All right, so before we actually get to the topics that Madison mentioned, I did want to pose the question of what is process validation. I'm sure there's some individuals on the call that have experience here and others that might not and are new to this. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, I do have some concise definitions up here from the FDA process validation guidance documents. So in simple terms, process validation, or the goal of process validation, is to prove to the FDA that your process is under control and you are delivering consistent quality products. So that's the main goal here, and we do have 3 different stages that will help you meet that goal in the end. Again, you might be familiar with these stages, you might not, but I will point back to these at some points during the presentation. Stage 1, this is process design. So this is where your research and development or scale-up activities will take place. You're going to begin to gather those initial data points to start to form your process from start to finish, and then also get to know your drug. And then stage 2, this is process qualification. This is where the process performance qualification batches, or PPQ batches for short, will take place. And this is where you will perform your batches 3 times from start to finish. And there's a lot of different data collection that takes place during those batches. And a bunch of different tests will be done to verify that your process is successful and we're meeting that overall goal. And then stage 3, this is continued process verification. So here you're continuously analyzing data during commercial manufacturing to show that your process continues to be in a state of control. So at this point, the FDA has approved the drug for commercial manufacturing, but you can't wipe your hands clean of the process there. You must still work towards that overall goal to show that your process remains in a state of control through those commercial batches. So as I mentioned, we'll come back to these throughout the presentation once we start to go through the slides. So now moving into the content here, our very first challenge will be complex processes, and we'll make our way through the additional challenges on the upcoming slides. All right, so to set the stage here, I did want to discuss my role in process validation prior to working at Kneat a bit farther. So I was a process validation engineer at a contract manufacturing organization, primarily in drug product manufacturing, but I do have some experience in drug substance as well. So what I did is I would take part in a lot of different meetings with different clients. I would come in at the end of stage 1 and help with scale-up activities, and I would oversee the process performance qualification batches and help them along their route into stage 3 of process validation. So I would go into the clean rooms, oversee a lot of these different studies, anything that would pertain to me, but a big part of it also was those meetings. So in those meetings, I have a few items up on this slide, the important items that would be discussed. The first one is sample requirements, or the sampling plan of the process performance qualification. So this is something that would typically be determined by our clients beforehand using a risk-based approach. That proposal would be sent to the contract manufacturing organization, and it would be reviewed, essentially just to make sure that samples can physically be taken when we want them to be taken. There has to be a sample port or certain openings where those can be extracted. But once everything is in agreement there, this is something that would be captured in the PPQ protocol for the samples that will be taken, as well as a place for us to record the results. And then the next item, critical process steps. This is another one that would be determined by the client during stage 1 of process validation. So there's a lot of research and development studies that go into determining these critical process steps and what would impact the product versus what would not impact the product. And then the last one here is the product requirements. So each product does have different requirements that must be in a state of control, or else the batch could be at risk. So I do have a few examples in parentheses here. The first one is light sensitivity. So some products do require the lights to be turned off during manufacturing in the clean room to not harm the product or degrade the proteins. We do still have small lights, so it's not completely pitch black, but the main lighting fixtures do have to be turned off. And then also time constraints. So some products do have overall time limits at a certain state of the product and at a certain temperature, and it must reach the next manufacturing step within that time limit, or else the batch will be at risk as well there. Those are just a few examples and a few items that we would discuss. There are a bunch more than that, but these are some of the big ticket items. And also it's important to note that all of those items are different for each process and each product, and they do require extensive research to determine those items. So criticality levels for the different steps, the restraints that must be put in place. And since these processes are so complex, it can take months or years to prepare for PPQ, that stage 2 step, depending on the size of your team and the time you have to put towards the project. So it can be a little difficult here, making sure you have enough resources to pursue a project such as this one. And for the solutions, I have a few of those listed here at the bottom. The first one, of course, is teamwork. So in those weekly meetings leading up to the process performance qualification, all the important individuals must be on the call. They must be actively participating because we do want to make sure all of these requirements are met. There's also a bunch of documents during this period of time that will be routed for review and approval. We have our protocols, our process control strategy, our validation master plan, which I'll touch on next. But those are all items that must be reviewed and approved in a timely manner according to the project schedule. So it should be prioritized. And then incorporating that validation master plan. This is typically the first document that's written when stage 2 starts for this project, and it details out any of the studies that were previously done that are of importance that we want to capture, and then also what will be done throughout this PPQ. So batch sizes, studies that will be done, what have you, and that makes sure everyone is on the same page on what to expect with this type of project. And then the last one is the risk-based approach. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier with the sample requirements, but a risk-based approach is commonly used to determine when samples should be taken and how many. We want this to be at the worst case parts of the process. And then there's also an overall risk assessment that's written by a team member as well, which details each step of the process, what could go wrong during those steps, and what is in place to mitigate that risk, whether that's certain batch record steps, a procedure, what have you. So we do have quite a few solutions here to ensure everything runs smoothly. But to paint the picture a little bit more on this challenge, I did want to show an example drug product process, just to show you an example of a complex process on the next slide. All right, here is our very high-level overview of an example drug product manufacturing process. There are 7 complex steps here, from bulk drug substance receipt all the way through filling. And I do want to note that this is only an example. There can be even more steps than what I've shown here, depending on what's required to manufacture that drug in the most efficient way. But through this, hopefully you can visualize how complex a process can be. I'm not going to get into each individual step, but if you do have questions on something specific, please send it into the chat, as Madison mentioned. And with that, we'll take a look at our next challenge, which is evolution of regulatory standards. All right, so this one can pose as a challenge when there are different standards that evolve and change over time. And it's important that these standards do not change super often, so that's important to note. But when they do, documentation will need to be updated. And most companies in this regulated industry, they do incorporate the most up-to-date regulatory standards within their comprehensive documentation, which includes things such as your standard operating procedures, your SOPs, your work instructions, your different plans, documents that you have for different validation disciplines. But then when these regulatory standards change, it is important to update that documentation that is impacted to ensure that your company is following the most up-to-date standards. And we all know that it can be time-consuming to update a few different documents at the same time. You have to really focus on those, but it is very important to make that update when a large regulatory update occurs, because if your company is not following these standards, there can be serious consequences for a company, including legal consequences, which can impact a company's reputation forever. So if we think about that, if we would rather update our documents or potentially have reputation at risk, you probably want to update those documents. So very important to implement this. And then the solution here is typically regulated companies do have a regulatory affairs group. It might not go by that exact name. Sometimes this group is merged with other groups depending on the size of the company. But that individual does stay in touch with all the standards, and they ensure that the company is following those standards and seeing them through. And it's also typically part of a procedure to have that regulatory affairs specialist on the document review panel for important documents, just so they can double check everything, review it and approve it, and make sure everything is conforming with those standards. So very important to have a group that's focused on that so they can bring that knowledge into your company and make sure everything is on track. All right, and on the next slide, we'll go ahead and dive into the challenge of the vast amounts of data that process validation entails. Okay, so if we think back to the overall goal of process validation, that was to prove to the FDA or whatever agency you're trying to get approval from that your process is in control and delivering consistent quality products. So in order to meet that overall goal that we've discussed, typically a vast amount of data must be presented to that agency in order to prove this. So with this challenge, there is a lot of collecting, analyzing, and managing this data, which can be difficult. So I do have a few items listed here which can help with that data collection process. Having the data checked multiple times by different individuals, whether that's different engineers or quality personnel, is very important before it shows up in an approved report. So typically in my experience, there has been a performer and verifier that will sign off in protocols and batch records. So there's a double check of the data there. And then when the protocol data is routed for in a summary report, when it's summarized there's also an extensive document review panel. So having the data checked by multiple sets of eyes really minimizes error there, the potential error that can occur. And then analytics tools. So using things such as Excel, Minitab, and really any tool that can help automatically perform calculations for you and show the data in a visual manner should be used where possible. And I do have an example of a Minitab graph up here on this slide. You can see the upper control limits, the lower control limits, if there's any outliers outside of those specifications. And sometimes it's easier to read a chart like this than having a giant table with all of these data points where you aren't really sure what the trends are. So it is very common for different process validation reports, especially in stage 3, to have Minitab charts like this. And then our last point is automation. So in today's day and age, there are a lot more opportunities for collecting data automatically on the spot. And in my experience, I have dealt with machinery that will automatically collect stopper height for syringes, crimp pressure for vials, what have you. And this is something that's only growing more and more every single day. So having the ability to have data collected on the spot and calculated for you by machinery significantly reduces the likelihood for human error. So we have seen progression over time where machines are starting to take over jobs that individual humans used to do. And this is something, especially in this industry with the crazy amounts of data that we're dealing with, this is something that will become more and more popular. And then I do have another example slide of an example sampling plan, just so you can put into perspective how many samples we're talking here and just how much data is really analyzed. All right, so here is an example sampling plan for a mixing part of a process performance qualification batch. Keep in mind, again, similar to the flow diagram, this is a pretty minimal sampling plan, and there can be even more samples than I've included here. In my experience, I typically haven't seen less than this, so this is probably a good starting point just to show you an example. So under that process step column, you can see that these samples are for time 0 of a mixing study. On the left-hand side, we have our sampling ID. This is used to keep track of what sample is which. It's used to identify it. And also when the sample is taken, there's typically a number that's assigned to that sample. So you can go ahead and look at the results once those results are in, and you're also able to track that sample. And then we have our sample type column, so what is going to be tested with that sample. We have our acceptance criteria, so when we do get results for that sample, those results will be compared against the acceptance criteria to determine if it passes or fails. We have our sample quantity. This is how much of the drug needs to be taken away from the overall batch in order to perform this sample. And then the sample method. So I have very generic SOP 1, 2, 3 here, but this would be your actual method that the scientist is going to use to test that sample and the method that they would follow. And then also under the sample ID, going back to that, you might have noticed that I have backup samples listed for each. And that is because during process performance qualification of these drugs and drug product, backup samples are always taken for each sample, just in case something happens to the original sample. We do not want a missing data point. That doesn't look the best in a report. It would have a deviation tag to it. So we want to have backups just in case something happens. And then for a mixing study, these same samples are taken at a wide variety of different time points. So let's say for this one, we want to take samples at time 0, 15 minutes, 30, 45, and 60 minutes. That's 5 different time points that all of these samples would be taken at. And it's also common for samples to be taken from the top, middle, and bottom of the mixing vessel. And in order to do that, we do use a very, very large pipette to get to the very bottom of that mixing vessel, but that's to help us see if there's any variation across that batch, specifically with concentration. So if we take all of this into consideration, we have the 8 samples listed here. We have 5 time points for the times that I mentioned. We have top, middle, and bottom samples. If we multiply all of those together, we have 120 samples just for one process step. And if you think back to that flow diagram, there were 7 steps. This is only one of them. So these samples can really add up, and the data that we're dealing with here can really add up. So just hopefully that puts it into perspective a little bit on how big of a challenge this really is, but by following those solutions we mentioned, this can be minimized to a lesser challenge. All right, and next we'll go ahead and discuss a common challenge, which is department collaboration. Okay, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this slide since this is a common challenge outside of process validation, and it comes with simply working on working on projects in a group, excuse me. So with that, there can be different challenges if there's different individuals that have different priorities or different communication barriers. It also can be difficult working within your own company and also working with companies outside of your own. Everyone has different projects going on. So the solution here is typically up to the project manager. Having a very experienced and strong project manager and a role for this type of project will really help out the project as a whole. And they can assess the situation and diffuse different situations if needed, if things are not going well. So once they're assigned to a project, such as a process validation project, they will make sure that everyone is communicating and collaborating in such a way to make for a successful project. And if that isn't happening, they're able to step in and determine the solution there. They also are the ones who will schedule those weekly meetings that I've mentioned a few times, typically once a week or sometimes more, depending on how expedited the project might be. And they're going to use different tools to make sure that everything is on schedule. And then the last one, this might not necessarily be the project manager's job. It might be an engineer's job or someone else's job, but the PM will still oversee these activities. But you must also collaborate with all groups involved, such as suppliers or vendors for these type of projects, and allow enough time to make sure that you can hear back from them and get everything that you need from them. So pretty short and sweet slide here, but next we'll dive into another data-related challenge, which is the continuous monitoring challenge that comes with process validation. Okay, so this one can be a challenge due to the paperwork and reports that must be authored and hold all of this data, but it is a requirement from the FDA per that third stage of process validation, which is continued process verification. So a little reminder here on this stage, data is gathered from those commercial manufactured batches and is statistically analyzed using a control chart, very much like the ones that are on this slide, to show that your process has maintained a state of control. And also through this phase, if it's noticed that a certain parameter is regularly out of specification, such as on these charts, there's some that are in red that are outside of specification, the organization can assess that parameter. They can find out why it's out of specification time and time again. They can determine the root cause, and then they can come up with a path forward to minimize these deviations. So we have that corrective action, preventative action situation here. And also these instances will help optimize the process over time. So just because you've already completed stage 1 and 2 and you're in stage 3, you can always navigate back to stage 2 to perform some additional studies to optimize your process. This spans over the life cycle of the drug. I skipped forward. All right, and then also if this is a great way that's in place, or this is a great thing that's in place to ensure that all of your critical process parameters are in a state of control. And if they are not in a state of control, the batches could be aborted, which would cost a company thousands and sometimes millions of dollars. So if that out of specification result, on the other hand, is not caught and that batch is released to the general public, there will be product recalls, which can impact a company's name forever again. And it is rare to have things recalled, such as what I just described, because the FDA has things such as this continuous monitoring phase in place. And if you do see those recalls, there's typically something deeper going on with that company that needs to be assessed, because with all of these items that are in place, we are able to identify things that are going to impact the product and not let it get as far as being released to the public for human use. So the solution to this challenge is very similar to the data analytics challenge with the vast amounts of data, but individuals should automate the data collection process where they can. Data must be reviewed by multiple individuals, so many people can find mistakes, and analytics tools can also be used here, as you've seen on this slide. On to the next one, we'll walk through the challenge of making changes to an already validated process. So this one's a little trickier. At times and for a variety of different reasons, a change to the current validated state of a process may be required. And if a change must be made, the process as a whole and also the impact to the product must be assessed. And if it's determined through that assessment that this is a major change and it will impact the product, revalidation will need to be completed through the company's change control process. And through this revalidation process, it's very typical for an addendum process performance qualification batch to be manufactured with the new change. So this is just one batch where a common complete PPQ is 3 batches, but this one will just be one confirmatory batch with that change to make sure that there's no variability to the data and it remains the same when it's compared to that original PPQ. And I have included some examples here of critical changes that would require an addendum PPQ batch. The first one is a change in a component. So whether that's a vial, syringe, stopper, seal, it does impact the filling process. The drug does directly touch that component. So with that in mind, an addendum PPQ would need to be done. And also it would need to have a major focus on the filling process of that batch. And then also if there's a change in batch size where a new piece of equipment is needed, For example, if you need to increase your batch size, let's say you have been manufacturing 50-liter batch sizes in a 60-liter tank, but now you need to double that batch size because you need a greater output for a variety of different reasons. You, for obvious reasons, can no longer use that 60-liter tank. That 100-liter batch size will not fit in there. So you will need a new tank to be qualified and then an addendum process performance qualification batch. And then similar to that, if there's any change in equipment that's not like for like at any point in the process, you're going to need a confirmatory batch. And then the very last example is if there's a change in the drug substance supplier. So this one might be argued that the drug will be exactly the same, just different supplier, but there can be little minuscule changes that can impact the critical quality attributes and process parameters of the drug that may be overlooked. So an addendum batch is typically done to make sure everything is all good and nothing is impacted. So for solutions for this one, it's a little trickier because changes can come out of the blue and you might not anticipate them every single time. But if you can, definitely taking a look at any potential changes, the time commitments and monetary commitments that it would take to implement that change must be assessed as soon as possible, especially if it can be assessed prior to the initial validation of the process. That would be best case scenario. But like I mentioned, you can't always predict when a change may occur. Let's say you ran out of vials and your supplier is having some issues and you need a new vial. Sometimes you can't always predict those. All right, and now we'll move on to our very last challenge that you saw a little sneak peek of, which is adequate resources. So this one is another challenge of process validation. Some solutions here are investing in training and development. If time is not set aside to onboard individuals and also continuously train them on new circumstances, there is more and more room for error. And there have been situations where companies expand so rapidly and they don't have enough people or time to train the new hires. And this can actually cause a chain reaction to poorly manufactured products, and this can worsen over time. So very important to set time aside for that. Then the second point, time must also be set aside to accurately and successfully complete different activities, whether that's manufacturing line time, training, again, going back to point number one, or just doing your own work that you have to do every day. Making sure you have enough time to complete those tasks is very important. If we're in a rush or if we're multitasking, which I know some of us might not want to admit that they aren't the best at multitasking, because it is something that we try to do time and time again, but mistakes will occur when we try to rush or multitask, especially on the manufacturing floor. So making sure there's enough time to complete these batches and making sure everyone's able to move at their own pace is very important and will help minimize mistakes. And then the last one, validation software solutions can also help here. They can help streamline your validation processes. They can help with document management, and then they can also help facilitate compliance with industry standards. So all great things here. Before we close out this portion of the presentation, I did want to show you all the State of Validation 2023 survey that Kneat gathers data for, and the results on what was deemed the most challenging aspect of validation as a whole this year. So for some background here, first of all, the State of Validation 2023 is the second edition of the State of Validation report. We had the first edition released last year in 2022. And what this report is it's an annual series of validation industry report, which Kneat Solutions gathers data for and authors. And it sheds light on different practices, trends, and challenges of the global validation industry. So I do have the URL here where you're able to download this survey for yourself. I really highly suggest doing so. There's a lot of great information in there, even more than what I'm covering today. So when the presentation is sent out, feel free to take a look at that and look at the contents of that survey. But for the results here, there actually was a consistent ranking of the top 3 validation-related challenges between last year and this year. We have lack of human resources as the #1 challenge. Efficiency is second, and then lack of technological resources is third. So this bar graph on the left-hand side shows the different options that there were and where each challenge fell. And since these 3 challenges continue to be the top 3, it does show that they're the most pressing concerns, at least for last year and this year. And then the table on the right shows the different company types and the #1 and #2 validation-related challenges. So again, here we have lack of human resources for #1 for most of these, and efficiency ranked second, which is very consistent. But some of them have them swapped or they have a different option there, but those are the main ones that we are seeing. And then of course, digital validation solutions do have the capacity to alleviate these capacity challenges that we're seeing here, and they can also make the work of validation engineers more efficient. That actually wraps up our process validation challenges and solutions portion of the presentation today. Now we'll go on to our second topic, which is key trends and innovations in process validation and validation as a whole. All right, so first with the trends, I've also pulled some statistics from that State of Validation 2023 report here to help paint the picture a little bit more and show trends that we've seen over the past year. So actually, most respondents, which was 56%, have adopted a fully digitized approach to validation this year. And there is a clear trend here towards leveraging technology to enhance validation processes. And this also does show that the industry is recognizing the benefits offered by digital solutions and that most individuals are beginning to steer in that direction. And then, of course, on the other hand of things, 46% of respondents still perform all validation processes without the aid of a digital validation solution. So, of course, there's still room for improvement here. Many companies have yet to begin their digital transformation journey, and they're still relying on some traditional manual methods. But in these situations, we do believe that there's a hybrid process taking place where they might have document management online to organize summary reports and documents such as those, but there's still a paper-based process taking place with protocols, forms, batch records, what have you. But the good news is when we compare the results from 2022 to 2023, there is a very large increase here of people adopting the digital validation technology approach. There's a 42% point jump, but there is still room for improvement as this grows in the industry. And there are many benefits to digitizing your validation systems for process validation and also any validation process. And those include enhanced efficiency, which we saw was the #2 ranked challenge in the previous slides. You're able to complete test execution using your laptop or your tablet. You're able to remotely review and approve documents. So I'm sure some of you sometimes have to go on site to review a protocol or a batch record, but you no longer have to do that. All of those documents are online. And then also the extra audit readiness buffer. So you no longer have to have that powwow in the back room when there's an auditor on site or someone's running around trying to find protocols and important documents. It is very easy to pull those documents from a software that contains all of your validation information. And with that, we'll take a look at innovations next, data analytics and machine learning specifically. Okay, so these are 2 innovations in the validation industry that are beginning to transform process validation by having the ability to discover those patterns, trends, and insights from the vast amounts of data that we presented as a challenge in those previous slides. So starting with machine learning, this can be a wide variety of different programs, but this allows for that first point, that predictive analysis aspect, where potential deviations can be predicted or quality issues can be predicted based on historical data. So this does allow for that proactive approach, which ensures that you're consistently performing and giving out high quality products from your manufacturing process. And this is all that the FDA, or again, whatever agency you're seeking approval from, wants to see. So it's very helpful there. And then for data analytics, again, this is things such as Excel or Minitab. You have that pattern recognition aspect where hidden patterns can be identified, and also correlations can be identified in manufacturing data, which aids in process optimization. So that's why this is a very big one for stage 3. If you remember back to that slide, that's a big opportunity for optimizing your process by looking at the data from your batches. And then the last one, risk assessment. So these advanced analytics tools can help in the development of these risk-based strategies and allow for them to be more precise as well. Right, and then we'll walk through our last 2 innovations, which is sustainability and green validation, and how that's relevant in today's validation processes. Both of these are 2 more examples of innovations within process validation and also the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. And organizations are beginning to practice these different innovations more and more. They want to incorporate sustainability in manufacturing and also green validation, which helps them focus on reducing their environmental impact, their waste, and also the resources that are used throughout the process. So some key elements here. First one is reducing waste, and the one that can really help with this one is reducing the need for paper. And I did want to read off a quick statistic from the Therapeutics Good Administration, which really stuck out to me. And that is one large global pharmaceutical company will archive and store up to 8 million pages of compliance documentation for regulators to call upon during an audit. And that number of pages is equivalent to destroying over 800 trees. So if we just take a second and think about that, I'm sure we can all think of quite a few large global pharma companies, and if all of them are destroying 800 trees, that's not looking too good. So what we can do is really follow that one and reduce the need for paper and put emphasis on that, because just that one change can make a huge difference. And then implementing energy efficient technologies. So some examples here are implementing optimized HVAC systems or LED lighting, which can be a pretty easy one to incorporate, but really anything that can optimize your process and reduce those energy intensive activities, And then with those first 2, you can achieve that last one of reducing your carbon footprint. So just by digitizing your validation lifecycle documents instead of using paper will definitely take you into that first step, and then also having those energy efficient pieces of equipment. All right, so that concludes our trends and innovations, and we're actually on to our last topic of the presentation now, which is best-in-class digitalization methodology, and we'll finish with a very quick demo. Okay, just 2 examples to go through today of this digitalization methodology. The first being Kneat GX, which I'm sure almost all of you on this webinar are familiar with today since you were able to sign up for this webinar. But in case you are not familiar, Kneat is a paperless validation software that can be used to digitize your validation process. So there are a lot of different beneficial features here. I'll just focus on the ones that I have up here on the slide. First one, test execution. So this can be done from your laptop or your tablet now. You can enter and record results right then and there. You can also open up deviations through your protocol, and you can upload evidence directly into any test script. So some things you might have not been able to do before, but now are able to be done. And then review and approval. So I touched upon this a little bit. Everything will now be online. You don't have to go on site to take a look at a protocol or anything like that. And then also Kneat has an inbox that you can easily navigate to where you can see what documents are waiting on you for review and approval. And you also receive an email when it is first assigned to you. And then the audit trail feature, so you're able to see user actions, corrections, and changes, as well as the date and time it took place. And there's also different filters in the audit trail area of the software, where if you're looking for a specific action, you can filter it down to try to identify those, which is really nice. And then reporting, you're able to run status reports for different projects or systems with our document metrics report. There's also a wide variety of different reports where you might have had to pull information manually before, but now in just adding a few fields here and there and completing the search, you can have it all at your disposal, such as the reports traceability matrix. We have an issues report and a test section report, all great tools that are regularly used. And then of course, the intuitive user interface. It's very easy to get where you need to go in the program. You're able to get to a document or document template or the audit trail very easily. And then the last item, data sharing techniques. So there are a wide variety of different properties that can be embedded into the document templates. There's library properties and system properties. And then also tag ID management is a really big one, specifically used in process validation for data sharing. And that is the demo that you will see next, is that tag ID management feature. All right, and then moving on to the process analytical technologies, or PAT for short. These leverage advanced analytical tools and technologies to monitor, analyze, and control different parts of a process in real time. So this is something that's really going to explode, just like as we mentioned with automation. And there's a few key roles of PAT that I'm going to cover really quickly. The first one is real-time data collection. So you're able to have immediate insights into your critical process parameters during the process and if the product is impacted in any way. And then also with real-time data collection, this feeds into the early detection of deviations. It does have the ability to detect these sooner since you have that real-time data, and it can compare the real-time data against your predefined control limits, such as what is in your process control strategy. So very awesome stuff there, and it can identify issues as they occur. And then with those first 2 points, you're able to make decisions even faster than you have before, with being able to detect those deviations early. So you're able to prevent quality issues from going too crazy. You can minimize waste, and you can also optimize the resources that you have at hand. And then lastly, the automation and control aspect. So PAT can be integrated with other process control systems, and it can enable automated adjustments when deviations are detected. So in my experience, I worked on a syringe filling line here and there when there were validation activities going on it, and it would measure the stopper height. And if it noticed that that stopper height measurement had been out of specification for a few syringes in a row, the system would actually recognize that and adjust itself, so it would be back in specification. So really interesting and awesome stuff that hasn't been around forever, but is growing more and more as the years go on. And also one quick point before we move on, Kneat can actually integrate with PAT. And if anyone on the webinar is interested in that feature and functionality, please let Madison or myself know, and we can get you in touch with the appropriate individual on the Kneat side if you're interested in that. All right, so that actually wraps up the majority of the content, and the last thing for today is a quick demonstration on tag ID management.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I know we are at the top of the hour. There is another question or two that's come in. So if people want to stick around for a few more questions, we'll do that and then wrap it up very shortly, if that's okay with you, Olivia.
That sounds great.
Okay, so the next question that did come in was, is a user requirement management and test manager option a part of Kneat?
User requirement?
management, yeah. Do we need maybe some more details for that question?
Yes, I'm wondering if that's part of the access setup with the CS or yes, a little more detail would be good.
Okay, yeah, if someone else wants to provide it, or sorry, if the person that asked that question wants to provide a bit more detail, if not, we can follow up with you directly. There were also a couple of questions just around the actual recording of this presentation. So essentially, early next week, an email will be sent out. It will have a copy of the slides and recording of today's presentation for you to review. There were also some questions about the state of validation survey. So I did post into the chat for everyone to see a link to that, and it'll allow you to access the report as well as a webinar that covers some of the findings in it from earlier this year. This is the second year of us running it, and it will be launching again in the spring of next year. And essentially, it's a collection of data from professionals like you on the line. So thank you for those questions. The next one here is, what do we got here? With so many possibilities for disparate sources and types of data like LIMS, MES, hard copy batch records, how can Kneat best help facilitate or even automate the compilation of this data into a paperless protocol to avoid transcription and multiple human verifications?
Sure, that's a really great question. The main one that we have is that tag ID management example that was shown. And in my previous experience, we would typically take a look at LIMS. LIMS is something that I use, and we would record that result in the protocol. So a very similar process would happen there, but I am curious on if that's something that could also be integrated with Kneat. So we can go ahead and check on that as well to make it easier, because we're all for efficiency here. We want to minimize the number of times that you type in a result or you type in the information as much as possible. So that would be something great to look into as well.
That's awesome. Thank you for that feedback. And here's, if there is a change, is only one additional validation required, or do you need 3?
That is also a good question. It does depend on the change. For example, at my previous job as well, we had different filling lines, and we had some customers who would start on just the syringe line, but would want to move to a different filling line. For example, the flexible filler that fills both vials and syringes. And that is a very, very large change where you're switching a whole line of equipment and a bunch of different qualifications need to be done. So in that case, you would need to do 3 batches. Doing the 1 conformatory batch, that's still a pretty critical change, but it's not something that would impact filling or a giant part of the process. So that's something that's typically discussed internally on what the risks would be if only 1 is done, or if it's better to do 3. But changing a filling line is a really good example that I dealt with a few times where you would need to do 3 batches there.
Perfect. I'll ask one more and then we'll wrap up today, just because I do want to be mindful of people's time. Is there a way to document URS and route for review and approval?
Yes, Kneat does have that functionality, and actually that's something that would tie into the reports traceability matrix that I mentioned, and using that actually also uses tag ID management, but Kneat will allow for any documents really to be routed for review and approval. All you have to do is supply us with your templates, and we will actually load it into Kneat for you. We'll go through a review and approval process where you make sure that everything looks okay and we've Kneatified everything correctly. So that's definitely a very popular document that ends up in Kneat solely for the RTM, and that's something that definitely can be implemented for sure.
Wonderful. If you want to just jump to the next slide, I'll wrap up today. Essentially, we do have some upcoming Kneat webinars looking at putting validation into focus, how to solve today's challenges, delivered by Kneat's validation expert, Jamie O'Donnell. And the following day, we will have a demo webinar from our solutions engineer, Emma Carey. So you saw a very quick kind of 10-minute overview of a particular use case today with Olivia, but this one will dive in for the whole 45 minutes to see the application kind of from beginning to end and how to use. With that, thank you everyone so much for joining today. Olivia, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And we will be in touch soon with the slides and recording, and we hope to see you on a future webinar in the near future. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.